Joseph Thomas is a member of the Land Stewardship and Ecology team at Longwood Gardens. Joe grew up in the Philadelphia area and attended the University of Delaware studying plant science and wildlife conservation. While at the University of Tennessee, Joe earned a master's degree in plant science with a focus in weed science. Within the broader field of land management, Joe's primary professional interest is invasive plant management. Joe has family in Virginia and enjoys the occasional backpacking trip to the Shenandoah National Park. So thank you so much, Joe. Please go ahead and take it from here.
Hi there, folks. How are you doing today? I wanted to start off by thanking both Heidi and Margaret. You guys have done a really fantastic job, and I'm really pleased to be here with everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And can everybody see and hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Okay, so as Margaret said, I'm here today to talk to you all about Japanese hops. I'm going to start off with talking a little bit about the identification, the habitat where you're most likely able to find this species, and then we'll have a quick little exercise about some lookalikes, and then we'll move on to control and management. Advance the slides, okay? So some of the more boring stuff out of the way first. So I've been working in this field for about a decade, and I've been calling this plant technically by the wrong name this entire time. It's referred to as Japanese hop, not hops with an F. I was pretty shocked to discover that. The scientific name is Humulus japonicus. There was an effort somewhere in the late 2000s to change its name to Humulus scandens. So if you're doing research and you run across that species name, it's still referring to Japanese hop. It is not what you might be more familiar with, which is the common hop, which is used for brewing beer. It's the common hop, Humulus lupulus, is kind of a cosmopolitan species. It is native to North America and Europe and a couple other spots in the world, but they are two different species. When you're looking for identification of this species, we're going to start with the leaves. The leaves are opposite on the stem, meaning they are directly across from each other. And it typically has 5 to 7 lobes. It can go as high as 9. Oh, we got somebody here in the chat who can't see the screen, but as long as everybody else can, I think I'll just go ahead and continue.
Yeah, we're saying 9.
Okay, so here you can see I've kind of numbered the lobes here for folks who are new to plant identification. So you can see there that it's got these 7 distinct lobes. The lobes are palmate, and a good way to remember this is as if they were fingers extending from your palm. It means the main veins of the leaf all stem from kind of a central point. The leaf, if we zoom in a little bit, also has toothed margins. These are large, pointed kind of indentations along the edge of the leaf, and they all kind of point forward. Occasionally you get toothed margins that point backwards, and they're fairly large. If they were much smaller, we might call them serrated margins. The leaves also have a really rough texture to them. This is because they have these really short, stiff, bristly hairs on them. And if you look closely at this picture, you can see those kind of fine little hairs, especially along the veins. This is pretty characteristic of this species, and I'm going to say this multiple times because I promised volunteer groups that I work with that I would. These hairs can irritate your skin quite dramatically. Another classic feature of this plant, which I don't have covered in these photographs because I had to get the leaf to fold flat, is the petiole, or the stem of the leaf. That structure that joins the leaf to the stem is very long, as long or longer than the leaf itself. So here's a photograph of a couple of different Japanese hop leaves. They change a little bit in color or in size. In this picture, they're kind of moving from younger on the left all the way up to larger on the right. And you can see that the number of lobes changes. In the second leaf there, you can even see the start of another lobe coming off of that kind of bottom right-hand lobe as well. The stems are herbaceous, meaning that they're not woody, and they have these really fine and small bristles on them. The bristles is not a botanical term, but these structures are somewhere between hairs and thorns. So they're big enough to cause you injury, but they're not fine enough to be hairs. The vines tend to twine clockwise, and they don't have any sort of tendril structure. So if you guys are familiar with maybe grapes, there's a structure that comes off the stem that can kind of wrap around other things like other stems or a fence. Hops does not have that. It almost relies on the stem and the almost kind of Velcro nature of the bristles to kind of ascend things. And once again, this does cause pretty severe skin irritation. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the fruits. They're useful for technical botanical identification, but in the field, you know, the number of lobes, how hairy it is, the stem bristles, those are much easier characteristics to use. But they do have male and female components. The female is in the left hand of this picture, and they are small hop-like cones where it gets its name from. And the male is kind of a loose, what we call panicle. We have a comment here in the chat about when I refer to twining, it means that it can kind of adjust and spin and kind of grab and work its way up, as opposed to, say, poison ivy or English ivy, where it kind of just hits the stem of whatever it's, or hits the bark of the tree and kind of goes straight up. So I hope that's good clarification. Talking a little bit about the life cycle. It's in most places regarded as an annual, meaning that it completes its life cycle in 1 year. It's primarily wind pollinated, although it is the flowers are occasionally visited by things like bees. It really relies on wind to pollinate it. It's almost exclusively, this plant almost exclusively reproduces through sexual reproduction. That is using seeds and flowers as opposed to reproducing from, you know, runners or rhizomes or some other structure that comes off of an adult plant. And that makes total sense. It's an annual, it's only got 1 year to complete its life cycle. It's not going to be shooting out rhizomes to create other plants. And the seed is very frequently water dispersed. From the research I was able to do, sadly, we don't know a ton about its introduction. It was introduced in the late 1800s, most likely as an ornamental. Frequently with invasive species, you can find, or I don't find it, but some very skilled professionals will find like shipment manifests or other things like that. I couldn't find anything for this species, so we just know it was introduced in that time frame as an ornamental. It's very common in New England, mid-Atlantic, but that's us, and in the Midwest United States. It's also found in Eastern Canada and Europe as well. Here's a map from the USDA plants database. It's a really nice resource if you guys are unfamiliar with it. This shows its kind of broad distribution throughout the region. The USDA plants database does allow you to zoom into county, but I figured just for showing you guys different resources, this is the ED map, county map for Japanese hop. That doesn't mean it's not in any of these counties. This is just where it's been documented. And it kind of gives you a loose idea of almost its distribution throughout the United States. And you can see in this corridor, you know, between you folks down there in Virginia and our neighbors up there in New Jersey, New York, we're kind of in a really nice hot spot for it. The habitat for this species, it prefers full sun. It can grow in shade. I typically find that it's only a problem in full sun. You might be able to find individual plants or small patches in the shade, but really when you have to stop and say, oh, this is an issue, that'll be when it's in full sun. It also grows in wet soils, and both of these areas tend to be fairly disturbed. And examples of these disturbed areas can be open fields or old fields or agricultural fields that are reverting to some sort of meadow, roadsides, floodplains to different rivers and streams, croplands, especially if they're irrigated, and lawns. I really love the video that your group is putting out. So this discussion on impacts is going to be a little bit of repetition, but largely Japanese hops outcompetes native plants. You know, it creates thick mats of vegetation, shades out native species. When it comes to trees specifically, it can increase stress on those native trees through competition in a similar way, but it can also add extra mass. In this photo here, I have it climbing a telephone wire, but if you can imagine this is a tree, and it would give a similar effect. And if there is some sort of windstorm, or it's planted in some sort of wet shifting soil, that extra mass can help that tree fall over. So I have a couple of pictures here about this plant in the landscape. This is a photograph from the property where I work. And below this kind of pink line here is all Japanese hops. And it's a mat, maybe about knee to mid thigh high. I really like this picture because it illustrates some of the habitat. If you look up, there's trees in the surrounding area, but there's no trees directly above it. So if we were kind of trying to go into this area and reforest it and add trees, they would be facing this species as a problem. It's also by a roadside, which is pretty common. And then if you look there, there's some gravel next to that road. That gravel actually indicates a little bit of a drainage structure. So we can tell this area is by a roadside and it's wet, which is a perfect habitat for this species. The next photo we have here is Japanese hops along a little creek or stream here. Again, below that pink line, that's predominantly Japanese hop. You can imagine here that as the stream flows, if there's a large rain or a snow melt or something like that, that the water from this stream would breach the banks, flow along this stream. It could tear up any established species, could carry hop seeds to new areas. So we would definitely classify this as kind of very possibly could be a disturbed area. And we can also notice that if you look in the bottom left-hand corner there, you can see patches of soil and sand and gravel through the plants, indicating that this area probably gets quite a bit of abuse from the waterway. It's a perfect environment for Japanese hop. So here I got a little, you can at home with if anybody's in the house with you, your pets or something, give yourself a little quiz. So I'm going to flash a couple of series of photos up here and you can decide for yourself if you think this is Japanese hop or not. So here we have our first example. I'll give you guys a little moment to think it over. Normally I'd ask you to drop your thoughts in the comments here, but we've got so many people, I don't want to flood the comments. But so for those of you who said that it is not Japanese hop, you are correct. So if you look at it, it only has 3 lobes to the leaves. And as we remember, Japanese hop has between 5 and 9. And also the dead giveaway is the petiole. That stem structure to the leaf is much, much shorter than the leaf itself. So this is actually an example of common hop. This is the hops that are grown agriculturally as an additive to beer. And if you're really paying attention, going for the bonus points, you can tell the background of this photo is most likely an agricultural field. There's no other plants there. Here's our second example. Everybody take a moment and see if you have a guess. Is this Japanese hop or not? All righty. Now that everybody's kind of given it a little bit of a thought, this is also not Japanese hop. It's got 3 lobes, again, much like the other one. Oh, extra bonus points to Grace in the chat for noticing the tendril. So not only does it only have 3 lobes, but the lobes are very shallow. They're not quite as deep as they are on Japanese hop. And no teeth, another. God, you guys are really good at this. I didn't even notice the no teeth. I'm gonna have to add that to the slides in future. But if you notice off to the right of this photo, there's a structure, and that's the tendril that I was mentioning that some plants use to, adhere themselves to various structures. This is actually Burr cucumber, which is a native species as well. And here's our last example. Just give everybody a split second to take a look at it and see what they think this is. Is it Japanese hops or not? I still make the mistake, like I swear, like every 50% of the time calling it hops. Alrighty, so for those of you who said this is Japanese hop, you are correct. It's a tough picture. I picked one that was a little tough to gauge. It's got 4 lobes. That's most likely because that particular leaf that we can see clearly in this photo is probably younger, but it's more than 3. So it's kind of working its way towards that 5 to 9. The other structure you can see kind of in the background is that very long petiole coming off the stem to the leaf. And even in this kind of purposefully difficult picture, you can tell it is quite long. And then of course you have the hop-like cone right there in the foreground of the picture. So this is Japanese hop. So now that we've talked a little bit about how to ID this species and some common lookalikes and the habitat and things like that, we can move on to what are we going to do about this species and look at management considerations. So again, I promised my volunteers I'd say this. It dramatically irritates the skin, and that's primarily through those little bristly hairs on it. It's really important to notice that if you're working in a streamside or river habitat, populations can reestablish from upstream. So if you're doing, a lot of very good work controlling this species, and you look up to your neighbor and they have a huge patch, you might want to consider reaching out to work with them or maybe changing your own management. From what we can tell, the seeds survive about 3 years in the soil. Generally, when you read that in resources, I'd say like plus or minus 2 years. It's my gut instinct on things. So it's just an average. That's not quite as bad as some other species that I'm sure you're going to hear about in this series. I did come across a couple of resources that referred to it as weakly perennial. I have never experienced this in my own interactions with this plant. I imagine that the farther south you go, the more true this might be. I'm not sure it would change very much your management as you address this plant, but it's out there and you can kind of keep an eye on it. So the first thing that we start with is mechanical control. This is either hand pulling with gloves or long. Make sure when you're doing hand pulling, to use gloves and long sleeves. I've seen people in some instances with similar species like Mile a Minute use hard rakes. I think it's probably, in the end, it's hard to beat the dexterity and strength of the human hand. So excellent comment there. Thank you very much. Trying to keep this at a level where it's not too boring for some folks and not above everybody else's head. So thank you for that. You can also cut or mow this species. And the next slide here, we have some of my coworkers taking care of Japanese hops in a drainage basin next to a road here. By and large, pulling seems to be more effective than cutting. If you cut the plant, it can still put some energy into putting off new growth and eventually going to seed, which is the thing we're ultimately trying to prevent with this annual species. Both pulling, but especially cutting, may require repeated applications within a year and year to year. So within a year, you're trying to make sure that those individual plants don't go to seed. And year to year, you're trying to deplete what we like to call the seed bank. So the number of seeds that are hanging out there in the soil, waiting to cash in on their chance to become big plants, you're trying to deplete that seed bank. If you are going to mow to prevent seeding, you want to make sure that you're doing it when the plant isn't actively seeding, because you then run the risk that the seeds get stuck to your string trimmer or your mower and you transport them somewhere else. There are chemical solutions too for controlling Japanese hop. You can use a foliar, meaning we spray it on the leaves as opposed to the stem. And post-emergence means it's after it's germinated, it's a plant. It's what any 5-year-old would point at and say that's a plant. So that's what foliar post-emergence means. The most recommended product is glyphosate, although there are others that I've listed here. For any information about chemical, at the end, I'm going to give you some resources to look into, but always read the label and consult with experts. We've got an excellent question about when does it flower? You're 2 or 3 slides ahead of me, but we'll get there. Another chemical option that you have is using a pre-emergence. These are compounds that are applied to the soil and are either rinsed or irrigated in through either rain or irrigation water. And they prevent the plant from, not just hops, but all plants from germinating in the first place. They've found to be pretty effective. They're kind of tough to use. And even if you use them successfully, you're probably going to have to come back later in the year and either pull any individuals that escaped or do a foliar post-emergent spray. Because the tendency of this plant to grow in very wet areas, you want to make sure you're using an aquatic safe pesticide if you're using. Always like to highlight what we like to call in the profession cultural controls. So 2 things that you can do, which your organization is doing in force, is supporting planting native plants. You can do this either through native herbaceous perennials. That will reduce that bare soil and create less disturbed habitats. You can also plant native trees that will increase shade. Excuse me just a moment, I had to grab a drink of water there. By planting these kind of canopy trees, you'll increase the shade, and Japanese hop, by and large, does not do well in shade. For the first few years that you have these trees, you're going to have to take care of them though, because this vine can kind of swamp them. There's a fourth type of control generally assumed in my field called biological control. I slapped it on at the end of cultural control here because it's highly unlikely. This plant is so closely related to the agricultural hop. They don't want the risk of something that could damage the agricultural product, so it's highly unlikely that would be created. And most of us don't work with biological controls anyway. They're kind of the purview of state and federal organization. So thinking about timing, like I said before, you probably want to repeat control several times within a year and between years. Seeds survive, like I said, around 3 years in the soil. So this is minimum, I would say, a 3-year project if you were managing this on either your land or a public land or something like that. You also want to monitor for outside introduction. Like I said before, know what your neighbor's up to, because maybe your problem is a shared problem with somebody else. We had that fantastic question about flowering. This is a resource I pulled from the Minnesota Department of Transportation. They have a nice little chart here on different control methods and when to use them. Because this is from a radically different area of the world, maybe not radically different, but it is from the Midwest as opposed to the Mid-Atlantic. You may want to adapt to your local region. Maybe ask any local experts you have or extension agents, your own personal observations. And even then, it varies year to year. Like, for example, this year we're having a quite warm winter. So some of these milestones might be shifted a little later in the year. But it's a rough generalization. And it looks like flowering might happen between July and August, at least in Minnesota. So I've got some resources here for you. Invasive.org is a great website. It's a really nice launching off point to other websites and resources. They have great images. All the images that I have here that are not my own come from that website. They're a really solid resource. The other 3 resources I've highlighted the titles for you, but the full citation is there as well. There's Plant Invaders of the Mid-Atlantic, that directly applies to us, and management of, and then there's 2 fact sheets, one from Wisconsin, one from Minnesota. You can find these pretty easily with a good internet search, and most of them are available in PDFs. So with that, does anybody have any questions?
Thank you for answering them as you go along. You're definitely more coordinated than I am. That was really very interesting. I've never encountered this, but of course, I think the most important thing that we all learned today was not to try and go at this with bare hands. And since most of our volunteers will be, the first task of the volunteers is to alert the owner of the tree, and that's something they're going to want to alert them to, clearly. So somebody's asking, she wasn't aware of this, is this a big Virginia problem?
Hops is an interesting thing because it's one of those species where if you have it, it's a huge problem. If you don't have it, it's not. So I can't exactly speak for most of Virginia, but in my own dealings in northern Delaware and southeastern PA, I'd classify it as like a number 3 tier species. It's not quite as bad as multiflora rose, but it's definitely better than some others that you read. It's definitely more severe than some others you read about. So that's just my gut feeling. I'm not sure I can speak specifically to Virginia though.
Yeah, and it sounds as if this is primarily a problem in natural areas.
Yes.
See this much on residential property and maybe only on larger properties.
Yeah, and it's also it shows up in very strange places, like you know, you may not expect there to be a water issue around, say, a gravel parking lot or a railroad track or something like that, but it can show up in places like that where you wouldn't necessarily expect it.
Okay, all right, so we definitely need to be alert to it, and we are hoping to survey all those places except for the railroad tracks. We're not gonna survey the railroad tracks.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Let me just put that out there right now. Don't, nobody try and survey railroad tracks.
Yeah.
Bev is asking, do the stems have small thorns?
You could probably treat them as thorns. They're really more like modified hairs, but they're functionally, it's tough to call them thorns because they're not like spiky and stiff. I would call them, describe them as more bristly, you know, almost like it gives you the feeling more of fiberglass as opposed to being punctured by a thorn.
Mhm. Okay. All right, any other questions for anyone? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Joe. That was so interesting. And now we'll have it up there on our website, on our YouTube channel for the future. So it was a great way to start our series. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. I wanted to end with saying, you know, I love my profession and it's a really great profession to be a part of, but sometimes you can kind of, you know, it gets kind of bleak. There's a lot to do and so few people to do it. And then I join in a chat like this and see everybody here working. And I really appreciate all the hard work you do. It really, you know, is critically important. So,
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We basically looked around and realized that the current plan for controlling invasives and saving trees in Northern Virginia, in really most common areas and most public areas, the current plan has been to let them die. And like, wait a second, that cannot be our plan. We're gonna have to make a new plan. And this is our first foray into it, and I hope we can really make a difference here.